Hmm? Hello and welcome to our weekly philosophical talks with S.Friedman. We're very glad to see you all. So before we start, we would like to mention the topic of today's philosophical talks, which is the Holocaust, what the future decides. And now I would like to present a great American scientist, artist, and philosopher. Also, S.Friedman was acclaimed by the New York Times as a genius philosopher. And now, welcome to our philosophical talks. Please feel free to ask your questions, to give your comments, and we will definitely answer them. Thank you. And also, we would like to thank the U.S. Consul General here in Almaty, in American Space Almaty, for having these talks. And thank you very much, Stephen, for being here with us today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Aaliyah, for the introduction. I want to thank, yes, the American Consulate in Almaty, Consul General Eric Meyer, Elmira, Tracy, and Aaliyah for moderating these talks. I appreciate always the opportunity to present a philosophical perspective on a wide range of issues. Yes, tonight's topic is Holocaust remembrance. It is in association with Holocaust Remembrance Day, which actually was recognized last week. I didn't give this talk last week because I wanted to talk on the actual launch, of cosmonauts and astronauts to the International Space Station, which was taking place a couple of hours before our scheduled talk last week. So this week is devoted to the Holocaust. It is a topic that has dominated my thinking since college. And in fact, when I was in college, taking a course on comparative religion at Harvard's Divinity School, I one day sort of announced to the teaching assistant of the class that it seemed to me that human beings had endured such an experience, that the fate of any number of human beings was so horrific, so unimaginably intolerable, so inhuman, such an affront to everything that humanity represents, means that there's no complaining, right, about our circumstances generally. That the fact that some human beings could endure that type of fate meant that in some sense it was acceptable if that were my fate. And not that one wants to invite, such outcomes, right, such horrors, but it's actually a view that is related in a way to Christianity and the nature of Christ having endured in human form torture to death, so that human beings experiencing such an extremity of suffering can look to that circumstance, that occasion, that God, or the Son of God, underwent that fate. So it makes it possible, to some degree, to endure that. It sanctifies it, is a term that I like to use. It elevates the experience. It intersects Joan of Arc's last words when she was at the stake, about to be burned alive. She tells the executioner to hold the cross high, that she may see it through the flames. The cross being, the crucifixion, a torture device. I've stressed repeatedly that religions, philosophies must address the extremity of human experience. If you can't address the worst and find some satisfactory response, something that works in the face of the limit of horror, well, it doesn't matter if you can cure a headache, right? The burden is at that extremity. That notion that I presented that teaching assistant, she was struck by. She thought it was the sanest, the most wisdom that she had heard from a living person, but that seemed a little excessive to me, again, because that's the nature of the Christian sort of response to that, horrors. It's also something that, and this is something I have quoted in the past, something that I read some years later by the American philosopher Eric Hoffer, who was working in the 1960s and 1970s. He wrote about how his reconciliation to life as it is stems in no small measure from the fact that in his lifetime, men far more gifted and deserving than himself died like rats in trenches, in Soviet labor camps, in German concentration camps. Now, for me, it's not a question of how gifted somebody is. All that matters is that human beings have endured that fate. And so that, again, ultimately sanctifies that for the generality of us. Okay? And it certainly obviates the occasion for complaining, for whining, about our circumstances, about our station in life, right? So that the reflection on that aspect of the Holocaust is deeply salutary. Again, not to invite the experience. Now, some of my encounters with the Holocaust have been through personal encounters. I had a cousin who survived the Holocaust. He was in Auschwitz, concentration camp, Auschwitz, from which he escaped. He escaped by hiding in a water tower for 12 hours and managing to make his way out. So escapes, as unimaginable as that seems, again, given what we know about the extremity of the horror of those circumstances, is remarkable. Some years later, I encountered someone else, the father of a student of mine, who had escaped Dachau and Auschwitz. Now, what's interesting about my encounters with these people is that, for one thing, they were robust individuals. They were athletic, strong, and they had sort of strong personalities. You could see that if somebody was going to survive that horror, these individuals might have that capability. What was interesting too, though, was that they were not very open about details, and I didn't seek them. I didn't probe for details of their experiences. I allowed them to share with me what they felt comfortable sharing. Another experience I had was with a woman. At the time I knew her, she was in her 40s, but when she was 6 years old, she was in Bergen-Belsen concentration camp with Anne Frank. Now, I don't know if she actually knew Anne Frank or encountered her. I don't think she did. For one thing, she was very young at the time. She was in Bergen-Belsen towards the end, of World War II, just before the liberation. One thing that I noted about these individuals is that I didn't see sort of manifest scarring. Now, this obviously is some decades past the experience, but these were people living full lives. So there was recovery from even that horror, right? The human individual has, capacities that, can surprise us. But again, I found that there was not a lot of discussion of details, in the same way that I've met a couple of people who have spent time in prison, and there was no sharing with me of the nature, any detailed nature of their experiences. And I respect that, I honor that. But in a sense, in terms of what I was saying at the beginning, that the fact that human beings could experience that fate means that it's somehow sanctified for all of us. Meant that I wasn't so concerned about the details, right? When one can imagine the horror, one's heard, enough of, the circumstances to know, how again, unendurable, it was, and indefensible it was. One thing that does intersect these considerations is something that Goethe wrote. Now, I think the most important aspect for me about the Holocaust is, again, what it means in terms of what we can suffer, what we can endure, what we can accept in our own lives, in our own circumstances. But then, there's the condition, there's the consideration as to what can we do, to prevent such horrors from repeating themselves. Obviously, there's the general notion that being aware of the past, being aware of the circumstances, being aware of what can happen, what human beings are in fact capable of, is valuable in terms of preventing repetitions. But in terms of perspective, and the kind of perspective I'm talking about now is the type that relates to the Delphic Oracle, right? And the admonition to know oneself, right? Know thyself. Well, Goethe, the German writer, philosopher, again, the writer that Einstein most admired, famously remarked, "I consider myself capable of any crime ever committed." Not to have that awareness is not to have that understanding of self that the Delphic Oracle was advocating for, okay? Now, we can't know what we might be capable of under, various types of circumstances or extremities. What I do like to point out is our capacity for doing surgery connects with our capacity to torture. If we couldn't do surgery, and when we're doing surgery, in fact, I was in medicine, so I did a little bit. We tend to try to cover up, the body, the part of the body that we're not operating on. We don't want to be aware of the humanity of the individual, so that we can in fact do a medical procedure. But that type of distancing is the same type of distancing that can operate, under circumstances that permit torture. And when I talk about torture, I'm talking about torture to death, and that is a way to summarize, the nature of the experience of the Holocaust, that these individuals were in intolerable, so were effectively being tortured to death. Okay? And that, again, is the extremity that philosophy must address, any religion must address, and ultimately demands response. The writer Joseph Conrad was particularly admired by Bertrand Russell, philosopher and 20th century intellectual. Joseph Conrad stressed the thin veneer that civilization represents, that the institutions of society that keep us behaving in ways that are humane, can fall away, under lots of circumstances, lots of stresses, the types of stresses, for example, that were operating in Germany in the 1930s, the type of humiliation, the type of economic, stresses, all kinds of forces, converge. We've talked a lot about convergence in terms of achieving any given kind of result. Well, the convergences that operated at that time made possible, this catastrophic outcome. In a culture that had produced some of the highest achievements of the human spirit, right? It was the culture that gave us Goethe, the culture that gave us Beethoven, that gave us Immanuel Kant and other first-order philosophers, the culture really that gave us Einstein. So, and in fact, it was Germany up until 1933 that produced the majority of Nobel Prize winners, I think certainly in physics. Since that time, because a lot of these physicists left Germany, when Hitler, acquired power, came to the United States has won the majority of the Nobel Prizes. But again, Germany was as sophisticated, as cultured, as intellectual, as refined in certain ways a society, as humanity has produced or had produced, certainly in terms of individuals of that caliber. And it is hard to produce individuals of that caliber, right? I named 4 individuals of the highest rank, right? A country like, I think Denmark, for example, produced Kierkegaard. Now, Kierkegaard is of the rank of those individuals, but just to produce one such individual is a remarkable achievement. Not every society has done that. So, again, there are no clear defenses against that type of direction of society unless one is consciously aware, of what can happen under the right, namely the wrong set of circumstances, right? I've also mentioned in the past about how our ability to communicate, our linguistic ability, our language is what allows for coordination, and it's what is ultimately behind our seeing other human beings as human beings with an inner life, with consciousness, because we can communicate with them. To the degree that we can't communicate with somebody, or the degree that we will find ways to block communication, well, that becomes a means by which we can dehumanize or treat someone as if they were less than human or not even entertaining, emotions that we might empathize with. So there's aspects of humanity that, again, make these types of outcomes possible, and we have to be aware of them, right? When I was in college, one of the things that was, again, I mentioned that it's not the details of the Holocaust itself, but the meaning of it, the meaning of that extremity of horror and degradation, right? That was dominating, right, my thinking. But there was a film around that time, and we're talking about when I was like a sophomore in college. There was a film, not about the Holocaust, but that intersected my concerns with the issues that the Holocaust raised. The film was an American film. Actually, I think it came out in the late 60s. I saw it in a revival theater in Harvard Square that would play older films for an entire week. Well, the film at issue is They Shoot Horses, Don't They? A film that starred Gig Young, an American actor that probably is not too well known anymore, Jane Fonda, who is still, working. It was about marathon dancing of the 1930s, the Depression era in the United States, when there were these dance halls that would have couples dance in a competition to the point of exhaustion. The couple that would win would be the last couple standing. And often these dances would go on for days, and people would die in the course of it. It was a type of torture to death in some cases. At the end of these dances, the winner would get a small amount of money that he had to pay some of the expenses for operating the dance out of. So it was a film, again, about human suffering in its extreme. Now, obviously, the main difference between the circumstances I'm presenting, in a film like that and the actual Holocaust is people more or less voluntarily entered these dances. They didn't do so at gunpoint, let's say. But again, in terms of addressing or presenting, the extremity of the issue that, in the case of that movie, leads to suicides. Well, I saw that film 4 times in the week that it was playing, and it just added, to my concern, my focus on the general issue of human suffering in the extreme and adequate response to it. The other major influence upon my thinking, and this was much more specifically focused on the Holocaust, was André Malraux's Anti-Memoirs. It's a book that I've referred to before. I've quoted a little bit from. I'm actually going to quote a little bit more extensively from it in a few minutes. The book ends with a discussion of the concentration camps. It's about, maybe almost 10% of the book at its conclusion. So the book builds up to that. Now, when I've talked about the book in the past, I've mentioned that that Mulro had written at the beginning that the book deals with those questions that death raises about the meaning of the world. Well, towards the end of that book, Mulro turns to the issue of torture and torture to death. In fact, he introduces the topic, which will lead into a discussion of the concentration camps where 2 of his brothers died. Okay, Mulro was not Jewish, for example. He was not but he was politically active. His brothers were politically active during the French Resistance, and they were captured and they died in camps. So Mulro was very much attuned, to that experience and did a lot of study of the camps. Talked to a lot of people who had endured, that fate. The discussion of the camps is introduced with a comment that I use in a film that I did about torture that I will talk about after we deal with Mulro. Okay. The line from Mulro that introduces this whole issue is, the dialogue of the human animal with torture is more profound than that of man with death. Okay? Now, this was written about 40, 50 years ago. Notice he's using the generic man for humankind, but okay, the language is evolving, right? I tend not to use that term any longer when I'm talking about collective humanity. But that comment by Mulro, which actually begins my film, leads him immediately to a consideration of Jean Moulin. Jean Moulin was the leader of the French resistance during World War II. Moulin was betrayed to the Gestapo and was tortured to death on a train. Okay? The circumstances, again, you can imagine, were horrific. Mulro gave the funeral oration, because Mulro was also active in the French resistance, gave the funeral oration for Jean Moulin in Paris. I think it was on the steps of the Pantheon. That matters because of what I'm going to be talking about in just a minute. As part of the funeral oration, he quotes from Jean Moulin's sister, who also had given a tribute to her brother. And what Mulro quotes is, jeered at, savagely beaten, his organs shattered. He reaches the limits of human suffering without ever betraying a single secret. He who knew them all. Okay? That's the tribute that Jean Moulin's sister paid, and it's words that Mulro recited also. And again, that's the issue, the limit of human suffering. That again is what the Holocaust embodies. Right? That discussion, Mulro's discussion of Moulin leads to a discussion of Dostoyevsky. And that's what I'm going to quote. But because Mulro writes with some concentration and has references to a lot of different things based on his experience and his reading, I'm going to give you a slight sort of overview of what Mulro says about Dostoyevsky before I do the reciting. The discussion of Dostoyevsky starts right after Mulro has delivered the funeral oration about Moulin. So he's talking about the issue of torture to death, the problem of evil, the problem of extreme suffering, right, produced by evil actions. He recounts a visit that he paid to Dostoyevsky's adolescent home in Moscow. And when he was in Dostoyevsky's house, he went into the study and he saw a large photograph, an enlargement of a photograph of Dostoyevsky. A lot of what he is saying, that I'm going to be reciting, is addressing that photograph and commenting upon that photograph. He also talks about the fact that Dostoyevsky was sentenced to death for his political writings and was sent to a prison camp in Siberia. He was led to the scaffold, led to a gallows, and at the last minute received a reprieve. Now, it turns out Mulro had a similar experience during World War II when he encountered German rifles. He was about to be, he thought, executed, but it was a mock execution. It didn't go through. In the same way, Dostoyevsky was given a reprieve the final moment. The noose was around his neck and he was reprieved. He was freed. Okay? But that experience of encountering that horror, that, again, an extremity of human experience, transformed Dostoyevsky from a a writer of stories, a writer of melodramas, into the literary conscience of the world, as great a novelist and as valuable a writer as the human race can boast. Okay, and certainly Dostoyevsky is central, in my development, my thinking. Okay, I think that's enough to give you a sense of this passage. So now, one final thing, it's long. It's going to take me a few minutes, but the reason I'm doing this is what I'm going to recite is probably the single most valuable thing I have ever read. It is the single most valuable writing and the writing that I most admire. The writing that reaches the greatest depth of profundity in terms of the issues that it's confronting. Okay? So here we go. Dostoyevsky, Cervantes, Defoe, Villon, the men of the penal settlement, the pillory, or the jail. As I descend from the Pantheon towards the Seine, for the committee is meeting in the crypt of the deportees, I think of that garden in the Crimea where Gorky said to me, I asked a Komsomol member in about 1925 what he thought of crime and punishment. And he responded, what a lot of fuss about one old woman. Did that Komsomol die in a Soviet labor camp? In a German concentration camp? Has he at least learned something since then? There was an invincible hope in Dostoyevsky that emerges only in fits and starts in his novels. Meyerhold once showed me, after the old quarter of St. Petersburg, endless iron staircases losing themselves among the shadows of the canals, the writer's adolescent home in Moscow, where his father was a doctor at the military college. On the wall of the study, in a plush frame, there was an enormous enlargement of a discolored photograph. I knew those shoulders bowed by every form of misery, that death's head trimmed with a straggly beard, but they haunted the desolate half-light as if the discoloration of the bromide paper had recreated the past in a more convincing manner than any costume. It was in truth the image stolen from the living, which was once such a source of terror to the Asians, stuck on the wall of this room with its sorrowful gaze and gray complexion. But it was also a resurrection, this life-size image, all the more striking in that it manifestly belonged to death, in that it embodied that Lazarus whose mantle Dostoyevsky had long ago assumed, not in order to console the murderers and the prostitutes, but to shake the pillars which uphold the riddle of the world. Beyond the adjurations of love, the sorrows of the irremediable and of human suffering, the supreme riddle of what am I doing on this earth where sorrow reigns? I think of you now, Dostoyevsky, freed from your translations of Balzac and your Dickensian novels by the translations of the gallows. I do not yet know that in 10 years' time, I will be facing a mock execution, and that one no more perhaps believes in fictitious gallows than in rifles aimed at one. I think of you now, Orthodox and Tsarist, with all that makes your characters fling themselves with arms outstretched into the mud of public confession, and with that terrible silence of your discolored face on which night is falling, Your lips which need not speak for us to hear those words that have haunted our century. The only reply since the Sermon on the Mount to the holy barbarism of the book of Job. If the order of the universe must be paid for with the torture of one innocent child by a brute, I'm handing back my ticket. You did not invent the mystery of evil. Oh, you gave it its most poignant expression. It is not your anguish, prophet, which fills this shabby room, even if it is the anguish of our time, for all life becomes mystery when it is questioned by pain. It is the voice of Lazarus, against whom neither misery nor death prevails. The indomitable reply of Antigone or Joan of Arc before the tribunals of the earth. I was not born to partake of hatred, but to partake of love. It is the eternity which the psalmist sang, and which Shakespeare rediscovers 2,000 years later beneath the enchanted stars of Venice. In such a night, the lovers who sense the resurrection of the vanished lovers in the perfumed sky, and the cries rising from the German prison camps toward the Assyrian constellations. I think of the German rifles pointing toward me. It was on such a day as this, Dostoyevsky, that you stepped onto that gallows, which resembled a goalpost, of which I was once shown a clumsy drawing. Okay, so that is Mulro's enshrinement of Dostoyevsky, right? It's a remarkable passage, and it, I think, conveys, the profundity and the urgency, of the questions, the questions of evil, the questions of the extremity of suffering that the Holocaust raises as emphatically as any experience in human history. There's a summary of that, actually, that I wrote. It's in my work, The Books of Joshua. And let me recite it. So this is now my writing, not Mulro's. It goes like this. But again, it's a summary of basically what I just recited, with a little bit more added on. Dostoyevsky, Cervantes, and Defoe took Mulro to torture's heart, and Picasso, overwrought, received him with a blinding start. The order of things unjustifiably brings an innocent girl to the torturer's cart. Such a world were better left to spin itself apart. And Job is an ode to barbarity, despite the mode of deity or whatever it claims to be. So imagine yourself burned half alive. Then see what justification can survive. Well, that actually introduces a topic I don't want to dwell too much on, but something that I think I talked about a long time ago. The idea that when I first began writing philosophy, and for a number of years, I would begin the process by first imagining myself in some extremity of horror, imagining myself burned alive, imagining myself buried alive, imagining myself in a coma, but unable to move except fully aware. So I'm trapped, I'm buried alive in my body. Or imagining myself on a space mission, drifting through space to my death. Then I would say, once I had imagined those extreme circumstances, okay, now write philosophy. Because again, I wanted to make sure that philosophy could respond to the demand of those issues, those extremities. Okay, so and again, the circumstance of the Holocaust, helped inform, motivate, a lot of, my philosophical work. Now, I've emphasized that from a purely philosophical standpoint, philosophy is rigor, right? The limit of rigor. And it doesn't care about any potential applications. It's not here to design better bridges. It's not here fundamentally to make us happy, okay? It just so happens that the limit of rigor, in fact, has that power, and has that power more decisively than any mode of belief. So, and I've given the aphorism before that philosophy to answer the horror now and to the beginning and end of time with one question: is our logic stronger than our pain? Okay? So the philosophical development is partly a matter of developing those aspects of that logic that in fact turn out to be able to address pain at its extreme. And I've given you, examples of how, again, at its limit, at the limit of rigor, even physical pain can succumb to philosophical analysis and become voluntary. I've often, in conversation, mentioned to people that if you were ever to encounter something horrific, if you were ever to find yourself, in anything, comparable to the circumstance of a Holocaust, you had better be able to rise to the level of rigor that can address those issues. Within the Christian tradition, which does address torture to death from the outset, right? When Buddhists first encountered Christianity, they were astonished. They asked themselves, why do they worship a man being tortured? Well, again, it represents the worst. They're addressing the worst in order to be able to address everything, right? To solve the problem of human life completely. Okay, so starting from the worst, is really the best approach if you want that degree of a solution, that commanding, a response. The whole point of of a lot of the aphorisms that I've written is to give somebody something that they can even just run through their mind, right? When they're dealing with some circumstance, and basically switch it off, turn off the terror, right? In some way or other, right? Now, even though Christianity addresses torture from the outset, torture to death, and Christian martyrs, Christian figures who were tortured to death, but maintained their faith, and their faith sustained them through the experience. tend not to endure the extremity of human suffering, right? Torture to death smilingly, right? It's even Christ on the cross cries out, my God, why hast thou forsaken me?" It's not a joyous occasion. It's not something that one smiles through. It's something that one suffers through, ultimately, right? And the Christian martyrs, in general, suffer through the experience. What's interesting is that Buddhism has in their literature a different representation of Buddhism's relationship to those extremes. There are stories of past Buddhas that die through some horrific encounter. They might be eaten by a lion, for example, while alive. It's a type of torture to death. Right? In Buddhism, interestingly, in those accounts, the Buddha is smiling through the experience. It's a testament to the particular power, of Buddhism to just eviscerate the horror, right? To sort of undermine certain aspects of what seems to be the reality so that one can endure the horrific smilingly. Well, philosophy actually operates more in the manner of the Buddhist response than the Christian response, right? That philosophy operates by being able to, again, eviscerate the reality, like demonstrate that what you think is real or definitive is not so, or not necessarily so, right? That's the point of aphorisms like the past cannot guarantee the future, but the future decides the past. So it's a way of disengaging us from what seems like a burdensome, an unavoidable, an irresistible reality. No, it's not irresistible. Rigor is stronger, and rigor can deconceptualize it, deconstruct it, if you like. So rigor can provide a response in the way that Buddhism has a response to encounter these horrors with some genuine equanimity of spirit. Now, that is not to say that Buddhism or philosophy encourages one to seek out horrors to demonstrate the power of an intellectual response, right? Buddhism famously advocated against various practices of like self-mutilation that would by other traditions be a test of religious understanding or spiritual insight. Buddhism has maybe in principle the power to deal with it, but it doesn't invite and it doesn't seek out horror, the untoward, in the same way. Like philosophy, my work, doesn't encourage one to test to see how strong a philosophical result is. All of my testing, of these philosophical results and their efficacy, their power, has been based on whatever I've been presented with, right? The earthquake was something that I didn't engineer, right? It was visited upon me, and it provided an occasion for me to see if the philosophy was strong at a potential moment of death, for example, or in encounters with physical pain. Again, it's not something that one seeks out, but it's something that one would like to have the armamentarium to deal with and to transform into something that one has some control over, something that becomes, at least in terms of the experience of the pain, the suffering, voluntary in some way. Now, let me just make sure. Okay. I want to address a few other issues. We have time. One of the things that Mulro talks about when he's discussing the concentration camps themselves and the experience that people actually endured, right, based upon encounters with individuals who had suffered, through that experience. He said that intellectuals in the camps would console people, would help people, survive the ordeal by reciting whatever they knew. Okay, it was a means of bolstering people, buttressing them, against the horror and the inhumanity, the horrific indignity of the experience. Well, I read anti-memoirs when I was in college, a sophomore, and I realized I hadn't really memorized that much. Now, I think you get a sense from my talks that I'd memorized at this point a good deal. I had poems. I did that play in New York, Phalaris's Bull, that I still practice daily. I've memorized a lot of Shakespeare. My impetus, my motivation for memorizing, starting in college, was reading that account of the camps. I thought to myself, I need to have things that I can recite just in case, right? One doesn't know. Just in case that becomes my fate one day, I want to be able to help people through that experience by reciting what I know. So that was my motivation, and it's still something that I am aware of. It's still an operating motivation for me. Some examples, like if I were under those circumstances, last week I recited a poem by A.E. Housman, Easter Ham. I guess that was like maybe 2 weeks ago. Well, that would be a poem that was appropriate for those circumstances. Another one that I'll recite right now, just to show you any question. As I'm giving this talk, you kind of almost want to do what I was doing when I would write philosophy. Imagine myself in some difficult circumstance and then see, does this poem or does this thought or does this idea help me in any significant way? Well, another poem by A.E. Housman. I to my peril of cheat and charmer came clad in armor by stars benign. Hope lies to mortals, and most believe her, but man's deceiver was never mine. The thoughts of others are light and fleeting, of lovers meeting, or luck, or fame. Mine were of trouble, and mine were steady, so I was ready when trouble came. See? Now, obviously, a lot of my aphorisms are designed for addressing, these types of circumstances. Past cannot guarantee the future decides the past. We suffer not because what we know, and not because we do not know, and not because we cannot know, but because we think we know, unjustifiably, even under horror of circumstance, right? We suffer that we presume more than we know to the end of time. In that film that I mentioned about torture, I address briefly the issue of how the future can be a consolation. For example, when, like in that film, when someone is, again, nothing is, by the way, depicted in the film. One sees no actual violence in this movie that I'm describing that I did. It's all sort of playing out in the mind of the torturer, in the mind of the victim, and you're basically in the minds of those individuals and evaluating, well, what responses are working? Like in the course of the movie, I quote from different religious traditions, giving the essence of some of their consolatory response to experience, or major writers. I mentioned, I show a quotation by Confucius at one point, one world at a time. Does that help? There's a line from Shakespeare, men must endure, they're going hence, even as they're coming hither. Ripeness is all. Does that help? I mean, that's part of it. That's at the extremity of Shakespearean wisdom. Or something from a medieval theologian, Saint Bernard of Clairvaux. My teachers are the apostles. They have taught me to live. Do you think it a little thing to know how to live? Because if one knows how to live, one knows how to die, one knows how to live under the horror of a Holocaust, right? Does that help? And then I actually cited one aphorism of mine. To see life as dream is the beginning point of philosophy and the halfway point back to Eden. Okay? So one's listening to some of the greatest music ever written in the course of this film as a soundtrack. Does that help? What helps in the face of the extremity of human suffering? What is strong enough? Towards the end of the film, and I'm going to show you. I don't know how easily this can be seen or heard. Probably not too easily, but just let me just give you an idea here. Let's see. Well, see, it kind of goes like this, and a lot of the film is text that you read, and you can hear the music starts, that is German Minnesang. That is one of the greatest of German Minnesangs. Well, and then, see? And then in the course of the film, one deals with the actual story, but one is visualizing, imagining a lot of what's taking place, not again actually seeing, real physical violence, okay? But towards the end of the film, you are now inside the mind of the victim. And what the victim has done is to concentrate, well, obviously some of my aphorisms, into something that she can chant, that she can run through her mind over and over again as she's enduring this horrific fate that you're imagining her experiencing, right? And again, the idea is one asks oneself, are these enough to address the terror? And just again, to show you how this looks. Okay, so I don't know if you can really see that well. Okay, well, there's one. Now, some of the things that she concentrates are pain is decay. We cannot say. The future decides the past is a thought that will last. The future decides the past is a thought that will last. She runs these through her mind like over and over again to help her through this experience. Let's see. Let me think of a couple of others. There were several, and Not as it seems in life and dreams, not as it seems in life and dreams. Pain is decay, we cannot say, and so on. So again, philosophy distilled to, concentrated to very short statements that have a poetic power, hopefully, and an intellectual kind of clarity to rise to the occasion of the circumstance that she's experiencing. Now, one thing I wanted to just comment on, a little bit of an aside, there is a sequel to the film that I wrote as just a short story. And the short story is called Emily, who's the main character in this play. Emily is a diamond. And the idea behind that is about 60 million light years away from Earth is a star that is at the end of its life. And as stars do at the end of their existence, it has collapsed, contracted, collapsed upon itself. And in the course of its collapse upon itself, it has converted its components into pure diamond. So there is a star 60 million light years away from the Earth that is the size now of the Earth, but diamond. One enormous diamond. What's interesting is that apparently that star that underwent that collapse was about the same type of star as our sun. So the thinking is that at the end of our sun's life, it will also collapse and become pure diamond. It's an extraordinary image, right? Well, I use that image. Basically, the idea is that under the forces, the extreme pressure, of that gravitational collapse, diamond emerges. Well, in Emily is a diamond, we are inside the mind of this victim of torture as she transforms into diamond. And the story is told poetically. It has meter and rhyme, and the final line is, "Come see Emily, as one day the sun will become." But it's in relation to a response to extreme suffering and the circumstances of that suffering. It's actually something that I address at the very beginning of the play Phalaris's Bull. The very beginning of that play, in terms of the meaning of the title, the meaning of Phalaris's Bull as a metaphor. Well, I'll just give you the opening couple of lines. The philosopher Kierkegaard tells the story of Phalaris's Bull, an ancient torture device, a hollow metal shell in the shape of a bull, inside which a victim is slowly roasted alive. But it's so designed that we hear the screams as music. To create is to enter Phalaris's Bull, and our pain becomes beauty. Well, that is like a high aspiration, right? That we can somehow transform horror into something sublime. I mean, that's part of the impulse of art. That's part of the impulse of philosophy, though, again, philosophy, as I practice it, as I develop it, is something that makes the horror in its full extremity voluntary, gives us control over that experience by understanding, right? A certain understanding of the nature of that experience. Okay, there's something else that is a response to these extremities. But I think I want to tell you an encounter story I had. It's something that's in Phalaris's bowl. It is something that I've mentioned before. It's about the nature of the philosophical response to the Holocaust itself, to extreme suffering. And here's the story. I had a student once. It was someone I was helping in math, actually, high school math. And one day, he asked me, he knew I was writing philosophy. This was early in my philosophical writing, and wanted to just have a little kind of insight into what I was doing, what the nature of the philosophical work was. So I gave him a little 5-minute encapsulation of the philosophy as it existed at that time, again, early in its development. And he was captivated by it, honestly. He became a devotee of the philosophical work. He ended up going to a major university and majoring in philosophy. He would use my philosophical results as the basis for papers and arguing points. And he said, "You always won." So, okay, so I was happy about that. He came from, though, a fairly strict Jewish family, okay? Not quite Orthodox, but committed to Judaism. And when he began talking a lot about the philosophical principles, the philosophical results, his parents were concerned that, what is this exactly? You know, is this blasphemous? I said to him one day, well, who do your parents most respect, like within the intellectual realm, that I could maybe go and talk to about the nature of the results, and then, you know, your parents, you know, will see that it's just philosophy. It's not a matter of belief at all. Well, it was a rabbi that was one of the it was a rabbi at a very large, prominent temple in Los Angeles. A temple that had actually several rabbis. It was that large, and he was one of the principals. So a meeting was arranged, and I ended up talking with him for about an hour and a half. In the course of that conversation, I was giving him basically a sketch of, you know, my philosophical results, how they related to certain other fields, science in particular, but also psychology, and how it intersected various, like, religious traditions. I was also talking about this issue that has come up a number of times, about the ability of our understanding of a situation, the conceptual nature of the situation, to be manipulated and control the pain that we might feel. That pain was not an absolute, but was embedded in a conceptual framework. Okay. In other words, it's not something that is intractable, that cannot be modified by thought. In the same way that drugs can modify pain, well, thoughts are electrochemical processes. They, in principle, should be able to modify pain. And the philosophical thoughts seem to have that type of ability. Okay. Well, so at some point, we were talking about the nature of pain, and Judaism does not take that same view. You know, for Judaism, pain, you know, relates to a demonstration of God's will. And so there's an absolute aspect to it. So he, didn't quite, grasp what I was saying, and at some point said, "Well, I like my pain." He ended up apologizing for that, and again, it took a little time, but I was able to, clarify the nature of the philosophical understanding and response, that it's different than the spiritual understanding and response. And I was talking about responses to extreme suffering, right? And at some point, he asks me, what about the Holocaust? Now, I don't want this misunderstood. I don't think it's been misunderstood in my telling of it. I am anything, as you see, but a Holocaust denier, right? I mean, my life has been focused upon the Holocaust, right? As an exemplar of what has to be addressed, right? By a religion, by a philosophy, anything that claims our attention, okay? Or that can claim our attention, okay? But we know past cannot guarantee the future, future decides the past. And I wanted to convey that, to the rabbi. I thought he might misunderstand. I thought if I said that or something to that effect, he would throw me out of his office, right, as a Holocaust denier, because I'm suggesting that future experience can alter the nature of past experience, right? Now, that requires some significant transformation in future experience, right? That from where we stand now, there's no questioning what happened. I'm talking about something almost, redemptive in really a religious way. So I said to the rabbi, the future decides, even as to the Holocaust, and has power in principle to reverse it, has that power, not to deny it, reverse it, redeem it, transfigure it in some way. Well, he understood it, because what he said next astonished me. I wasn't expecting it, because I didn't know this. But he said to me, instead of getting angry, instead of saying, challenging what I'm saying, he said very calmly, that is what the Messiah is supposed to say. Now, again, I'm not the Messiah. Philosophy does not embrace that notion, right? If philosophy has a relationship to something messianic, it's at the level of thought, right? And that's what that rabbi was suggesting, that the philosophical response to horror, is in fact the religious messianic understanding that God has that power. It's really in the same category as the question, actually it's a question that's been raised in many contexts. Kierkegaard, whom I referred to a lot, mentions it specifically in his writing. Can the most heinous murderer be redeemed? Can the most heinous killer, the most heinous torturer be saved? And the Kierkegaardian response and the Christian response that I mostly see articulated is yes, of course. To say otherwise is to deny in some way, to limit in some fundamental way the power of God. Right? Well, the same thing applies to what I was suggesting about the nature of the future. The power of God religiously manifests itself in terms of future possibilities to transform the world or transform our understanding of the world. And that's another major point about this as well, right? The idea that when we're dealing with horrific circumstances, when we're dealing with the circumstance of human life generally, right? Which I quoted last time Tennessee Williams, life is unsatisfactory. That's why I became a writer. Okay? Well, given a sense of the unsatisfactoriness of the world, not necessarily at the extreme, of the Holocaust, but at varieties of levels, right? Well, that's what motivates religions, right? That this is a fallen condition, right? That we lost the Garden of Eden, or this is somehow, a state of, in the case of Buddhism, dukkha. Things are awry. There's something fundamentally wrong, that needs to be righted in some way. Well, there are two fundamental ways to go about addressing those issues. One is change things. One is technologically, right? To affect a change in our circumstances in some way. The other, change or modify or deepen our understanding of circumstance. The philosophic response focuses upon the nature of our understanding, that the future can decide, the future can alter anything that has come before it. That is a manifestation of the power of divinity, right? As opposed to engineering results in general, in terms of ultimate human happiness and human responses. We've been, I think, more successful engineering deep understandings, philosophically, religiously, metaphorically, compared to engineering alterations in the world that can bring us to Eden here and now. It's more a matter of seeing than creating or doing in terms of the philosophical response to even the Holocaust. Okay. I think we have some time. So there was something I was going to recite also when I was talking about recite. Oh, do we have any questions? Or should I recite? Let me recite this one thing and I'll end on this note, okay? It'll just take 30 seconds. Okay, so when I was talking earlier about things that I've memorized that I could maybe recite in a concentration camp, were that to be my fate, right? Well, one thing that I was thinking of that, and we have a little time, so I'll do it, is also from Joshua. And it goes, "It was the simulacrum of a dream, or so to others it would surely seem. A madman's state of mind we cannot glean. A bird of prey with vision all too keen, suspended high above and in between, the hope that dreams say more than they can mean. And Joshua awakened cold and covered in a moonlit sheen. Martin Luther could not leave confessionals at bay. He lived within recycled sin, resistant to decay. Try as he might, he could not fight the curse within the clay. And so did soul and circumstance divert themselves one day. Spirits do not boast, but pay witness to the host. They parse the terror and the horror, not the dolor or the farce, and seek to release a brodequin bone and draperies of flesh from a sparrow's home, elevated and alone. And Catherine sends her legions forth to embolden Joan on her journey north towards a trembling star. And her only trace is the wind on your face, blowing from afar." Thank you. And I think that concludes my presentation on the Holocaust. So, Aaliyah, do we have any questions? I think we have a little time.
Questions. Mm-hmm.
We do?
Firstly, thank you very much, Stephen. Yeah, we do receive likes, nice feedback from people. Eric Moss is saying, I really enjoyed these weekly talks.
Thank you.
And then the same comment from the same person. While visiting Expo 2017 in Astana, I took a side trip to Omsk, where I visited some sites associated with Dostoyevsky.
Really? That's interesting to me. Okay. Fascinating.
And then another person, this person is joining us today as well, and she's sending the claps. Thank you very much, Akmaral, for your comment and for your words.
Thank you
and
very
now
much.
we have got two questions.
Okay.
Let me read the first one. Why? No, probably the person mentioned, what about that pain may clean you?
Okay, in terms of when we say like purging us of something, I'm guessing, it reminds me of some writings by Keats, some responses to pain by the poet John Keats, whose I think 200th anniversary of his death was just celebrated a few weeks ago. There's a comment, or actually an image within the Old Testament about like life being a valley of tears, right? That there's suffering, right? And it's something that we would like to respond to, end under certain circumstances, transcend, transfigure, alter in some way, in the way that in Phalaris's bull, the screams become music, become beauty, right? So Keats emphasized that he saw fundamentally the world not as a veil of tears, but as a veil of soul making, as something that helped transform individuals into better people, right? That purged them in a way of a lot of the, I don't know, maybe undesirable characteristics of personality, less admirable characteristics. And the best example I know of this is the literary example of Shakespeare's King Lear. King Lear begins that play as an arrogant, imperious monarch, who addresses, everyone with we, because it's the royal we. He's talking about himself, but in a collective sense, because he embodies the state. He does not see himself as a human being. He doesn't see himself as a man. He is encumbered by all of these notions, these ideas of his being a king, being royal, being superior, being a dominant figure. So he has these, and he's aged, and these represent incrustations. He's covered with these layers of insincerity and lack of genuineness and decency and humility, right? Most profoundly. Well, in the course of the play, King Lear, the world is turned upside down on Lear's head. He loses the allegiance of his daughters betray him, or at least two of his daughters betray him. One remains devoted, but his vision is so clouded that he can't see the genuine worth of the one daughter that does in fact, love him for his humanity, not for the riches he can bestow upon her, right? He's abandoned, and he's losing his mind, in the course of all of it. So he loses his kingdom, he loses his retinue, the people attending upon him, he loses his sanity, right? And towards the end of the play, at this extremity of suffering, this extremity of loss, he wakes up and he sees the one daughter that has been true to him, the one daughter, Cordelia, who genuinely cared for him. And he says, "Pray, do not mock me. I am a foolish, fond old man, 80 and upward, not an hour more nor less. And to deal plainly, I think I am not in my perfect mind. I think I should know you and know this place, yet I am doubtful. And all the skill I have remembers not these garments. Yet, as I am a man, I believe this lady to be my child, Cordelia." So you see how he's been cleansed. He's been purified of all of his presumptions and claims that don't really embrace his genuine self, his genuine humanity. And that's what he discovers at the end. But he has to go through a world of suffering in order to achieve that simple understanding of his fundamental and redemptive humanity. Okay. We have another question. Leah?
Okay, I'm here.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And
super.
One more?
Okay, great. Yeah, we do have one more question, but I think we will leave that for the next session.
We leave that next time? Okay,
that's good. I would like, yes. But we have one more comment from a person. Thank you very much for your comment, Admiral. So she's saying, thank you so much for your lecture.
Thank
you. The same person, Admiral, is saying, it's my pleasure to be here and to be touched by philosophical ideas.
Well, that's wonderful. I really appreciate those comments. Thank you so much. Thank you. And I know I've seen that you've been sort of joining us regularly. So, I hope this continues, to be, an enriching experience. I really do. Thank you. Thank you very much.
And the question that we're going to leave for the next session is, have you wanted to say that engineering and philosophy goes hand in hand? Yes. So,
an excellent question.
We are going to have.
I like the question. I will definitely address that next time. Yes. Good. This is a good one. And
thank you.
And remember, what we're doing now is that I will do my talk next week. I don't yet have the topic. I haven't, selected the topic yet. But whatever the topic is, I'll do the talk. And then, last week we didn't have questions. So normally we would stop at like 10 after the hour, 10 after noon, and I would address those questions. Well, next week, I'll be stopping at about 10 after the hour, and I'll address that question and any other questions that you might pose next week. Thank you very much. Thank you.
So before we finish, thank you very much again for your questions, for your comments. We receive them all and we see them all. So one more time, we would like to thank the U.S. Consulate General here in Almaty, also American Almaty Space Team. And thank you very much, Stephen. Thank you for having this talk and for holding it. Thank you very much. And thank you, the audience, for joining us. We're very glad to see your comments and questions. Please stay safe and hope to see you next week. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Have a great week, everyone. I hope to see you again next week. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much and stay safe. Thank you. Okay.
Did it stop?